How do we know Jesus rose from the dead? Where's the evidence? Usually when I give a case for the resurrection, I talk about the evidence at hand. Things like we know the tomb was empty. No ancient source says that it wasn't. We know the stone was rolled away, or else how would we know the tomb was empty? We know that somebody looked inside the tomb, or else how would they know the tomb was empty? And it makes sense that an eyewitness would have told what he or she saw. We have reports that Jesus was seen by credible witnesses after his death and resurrection. Now, there are other historical and cultural evidences as well. But today, I want to come at the subject from a different angle, because people question the historicity of the gospel accounts. So here's what I say. Let's talk about history itself. Determining the past is neither a scientific matter nor a mathematical equation. It's a historical issue, and therefore it's based on a burden of proof. What is more likely than not? We can't redo any of it, so we have to think of it from that angle. So here's my case. First of all, it's impossible to prove that the supernatural does not exist. Really, when it comes down to it, the primary objection to the resurrection is that such things are impossible. So the core under investigation is, are supernatural events possible? Now, if you're honestly investigating it, you can't start with the presupposition that it's not possible. If you start with supernaturalism is not possible, then you are starting with an insurmountable bias, and no evidence will convince you. It's called circular reasoning, when you're committed to your position before the investigation begins. If your presupposition and bias is that rising from the dead is impossible, then evidence will never matter to you. Secondly, we know that Jesus was crucified and buried. That comes to us from historical sources such as Tacitus, Josephus, and Lucian, not to mention the 4 gospel writers and Paul, who was at the beginning a hostile witness. Number 3, we know that Jesus' disciples taught that he was raised from the dead and appeared to individuals and groups. That's indisputable. In 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7, we have a creed from as early as 2 to 5 years after the resurrection. Number 4, we know that Jesus' disciples intended for us to interpret the resurrection as an actual historical event. In Acts 2, for instance, a mere 7 weeks after the event of the resurrection, Peter claims they were eyewitnesses. Number 5, no corpse of Jesus was ever produced after the claims of the resurrection, nor was there ever any dispute that the tomb was empty. The burial place was right in Jerusalem. If a body were able to be produced, it would have been impossible for a movement to explode into existence in the same city in such a short time. Interestingly, N.T. Wright says, quote, "Neither the empty tomb by itself nor the appearances by themselves could have generated the early Christian belief. The empty tomb alone would have been a puzzle and a tragedy. Sightings of an apparently alive Jesus by themselves would have been classified as visions or hallucinations, which were well known in the ancient world. However, an empty tomb and appearances of a living Jesus taken together would have presented a powerful reason for the emergence of the belief." Unquote. Number 6, we know that the disciples' lives were transformed following their claiming to have seen Jesus in resurrection. There is no credible evidence that the apostles were anything other than sane, sincere, and reliable men. An examination of the writings, combined with what is known about them from history, shows them to be practical, rational men of sound mind. Their writings show them to be moral and sincere. At no point can we realistically claim that they are deluded, hallucinatory, lying, fame-hungry lunatics. There is no evidence of such an assertion. Number 7, Luke is widely regarded as a responsible historian and a reliable source. We have no credible reason to doubt his record. Number 8, Mark. Papias, in about AD 100 to 130, says that Mark wrote the memoirs of Peter. Most historians, even critics, agree that's true. We have no credible reason to doubt his record. Number 9, Paul the Apostle. We have some letters by him that are undisputed by scholars that they were written by Paul, who was originally a non-believer, a persecutor of Christians, and who was later converted to faith in Christ. Historically speaking, he's a fantastic source. He was hostile to begin with. Galatians 2:1-10 says that, and that's about AD 49 to 55. He's an early source, and he knew Jesus' disciples. He names Peter and John as disciples, and James, the brother of Jesus. According to Paul, the leaders of the church in Jerusalem in AD 50 certified that Paul was preaching the same gospel message they were. So the resurrection hypothesis is significantly stronger than any other competing hypothesis. Historical investigation will never give you 100% certainty, but it does give reasonable certainty. Historians must choose the most probable explanation. Now, based on the evidence, the resurrection is the most probable explanation unless you start with the idea that it's impossible, and then that's just bias. Now, some would ask, is there bias in the sources? They say, well, these were all Christians. What do you expect them to say? Well, I think it makes sense that if someone saw the risen Christ, from then on he believed that Christ had risen. But these men are no more biased in their conviction or writing than is a woman reporting sexual abuse or a black man reporting on slavery. If you think their bias is harmful to the truth of their claim, that burden of proof is on you. Next, do we have a chain of custody of the information? Yes, we do. Especially in the creed of 1 Corinthians 15, 3-7, the reports of Paul and the accounts of the Gospels. That the apostles report the resurrection doesn't automatically make the report disinformation. It could possibly be true information. It's not false just because it was reported by someone who believes the story. Next, is it possible that fabricated information is strewn in with the true information? Well, anything's possible, but I don't believe that's the case here. In any case, we don't dismiss the whole package because some of it may possibly perhaps be corrupt. Instead, it motivates us to analyze it more carefully. Now, just because the apostles are involved doesn't make the story untrue. We must evaluate the truth of the claims and not dismiss them instantly because the apostles were close friends of Jesus and each other, right? Right? Trust everyone, but cut the cards. Now, if you think some of the information is corrupt, then the burden of proof is on you to give evidence of that. Lastly, was there any opportunity for the evidence to be tampered with? Again, anything's possible, but not everything is plausible. But is there any indication that it's been tampered with? No. And if you think so, that burden of proof is on you. The bottom line comes down to what is reasonable to believe. Science does not and cannot show that miracles are impossible. So ultimately, science can't be our guide. History and logic give us the facts and the implications of those facts. The strongest case on the table is that Jesus actually and literally rose from the dead. So let's talk about it.